Good morning. If we have not met before, my name is Carissa, and I am part of the staff team here at Heartland. And to kick things off this morning, I am going to tell you just a little story from my college days, which you might think were really not that long ago. But this story, in fact, is almost a decade old. So, I know. So when I was a junior in college, everybody was raving about this class called Wisdom Literature, which might sound crazy to you, but as a youth ministry major, I was in the Bible department, and so those were the kinds of classes that everybody raved about. This class had a waiting list, and the professor, this was actually his specialty. Dr. Estes had spent his entire scholarly career studying the wisdom literature books, which is kind of mind-blowing if you've been here for the last 2 weeks and you're like, he spent his whole life doing that? Yes, he did. And then he was teaching it to all of us. So my junior year, I found myself in his class, really unsure of what I was getting myself into. I was a good student in college, but I wasn't really like a library kind of student, if that makes sense. And so I opened the syllabus the first day, and I find out that our main project for the semester is going to be writing a 30-plus page paper on 6 verses from the book of Ecclesiastes. Yeah, so here's that paper. I went out and dug it out of my college bin in the basement, actually kind of ironically enough, and of all my papers and books that I kept in this huge bin, this was literally the last thing in the bottom of the bin. So this is, in case you were wondering, 31 pages on the book of Ecclesiastes. I spent countless hours in the library. And so you might think, okay, well, when Carissa got assigned to preach on the book of Ecclesiastes this week, she didn't even have to prep. She had it all figured out. Well, no, because I literally forgot everything that I had written in that paper right there. And that might have had something to do with the fact that I averaged like 4 hours of sleep a night in college, but I also think it was kind of just information overload. Like, I read through it yesterday just skimming to see if I had any idea what I was talking about, and there's just like a lot in there. So thankfully, we are not going to be spending 31 pages on 6 verses today, but we are going to be going through the book of Ecclesiastes. But here's the good news. The good news is that since I forgot literally everything that I had written in that class, I'm starting at the same place as you. I had to go back this week, learn it all afresh, so I am not an expert by any means. But as I was kind of reading through this paper and kind of asking myself, okay, what was the point of writing all of those pages on something so short? I realized through my study this week that that's actually a little bit more of an ironic question than I first would have thought when I opened up the book of Ecclesiastes. So that's where we're going to be this morning. If you'd like to follow along, the welcome team will pass out Bibles. Those Bibles look just like this, and I can tell you that you should turn to page 455 if you'd like to follow along. 455. Ecclesiastes is only 12 chapters, so we're going to be reading a few passages and verses from various chapters today. But Ecclesiastes, like the class name implies, is part of the wisdom literature books. And if you were here the last 2 weeks, or one of the last 2 weeks, you might have heard Drew preach on Job and Proverbs. And Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes are kind of like the traditional 3 books of wisdom literature. For Heartland's purposes, we're going to throw in Lamentations and Song of Solomon in the weeks to come, but Ecclesiastes is really the last traditional book of wisdom literature that we're going to be going through today. And it's also one of the most complicated and fascinating, and I guess likely to be forgotten books in the Old Testament as well. But we're going to be going through, hopefully in a way that can make it a little more easy to understand than that paper did for me. And basically the first thing we're going to look at is kind of how Ecclesiastes is structured. If I had to guess, probably very few of us have read through the entire book of Ecclesiastes if it wasn't mandated for a college degree. And so hopefully this little overview kind of gives you a big idea of what the book is all about. So the first 2 verses are simply an introduction where we meet the main character of the book, so to say. More on that in a second. The bulk of the book is made up of what's called the teacher's observations. And then finally, we close, which is what that paper was written on actually. The last 6 verses are the teacher's conclusions. So in chapter 1, verse 1, we meet a character named Kohelet. Now, you won't see that name in your Bible. You'll simply see it translated as the teacher. And we really don't know who this is. This was just a wise man or woman. Some would say that it might have been Solomon. Some would say that it maybe was another son or another person in the line of David. Others would say that it was simply someone who had Solomon-like wisdom. But either way, that is who the teacher is. He literally is just that, a teacher. But the book is actually authored by someone that's anonymous, and the teacher is almost the character in the book, recounting his experiences and his quest for meaning. So here's how the book opens. It's really just a positive start to the 12 chapters. It says, "The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." Okay, all right, it's gonna be a fun morning. No, I promise. It's actually a very interesting book, but it's kind of a weird way to start out a book, especially because he says the word meaningless 4 times in one sentence. And there's actually a Hebrew word here called hevel, and that is what is translated as meaningless in Ecclesiastes. Fun fact, that word is used 38 times in the book. I did not count them. I cheated and used the internet. But 38 times. So we kind of come to the idea right off the bat that that's probably what this book is all about. Why does everything feel meaningless? Now, that Hebrew word hevel literally means vapor or smoke. So what the teacher is trying to convey here is that everything in life is temporary or fleeting, like smoke. You might even try to grab onto it if you think you understand or think you can see its meaning, but you grab onto it and it simply slips out of your hands and disappears. And if that kind of weren't depressing enough language, again, he goes on to use it 38 times to really make sure that we understand the point of the book. And I love that in verse 14, he kind of takes it even one step further, one step more depressing. And verse 14 says, "I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind." And so that kind of sets up the second piece of the book for us, and that is 12 chapters of the teacher's observations. So as a wise teacher does, he goes on to share that he's been on this lifelong quest to find meaning. He's experienced what he said in verse 2 and verse 14, that everything feels meaningless. And so he goes on this quest, so to speak, to see if there's meaning to be found anywhere. And here's his list, here's his conclusions. And in case you were wondering, they're just as depressing as verse 1. So he starts out with a really broad, everything is meaningless. Spends the whole of chapter 1 going through that just to really clear things up in case there was any confusion. Then he starts to get more specific, and in chapter 2 he says, pleasure, wisdom and folly, and toil are all meaningless. Then in chapter 3 we have time and death are the 2 great equalizers. So basically what that means is that no matter what happens to you, time will still pass as it always does, and everyone's going to die. And then in chapter 4, he says that advancement is meaningless, meaning that if you were to try to find pleasure or meaning in your work or your career or your accomplishments, that's pointless. And then chapters 5 and 6, riches are meaningless. So that's kind of a good list there. That basically covers just about everything that we might be trying to pursue, as it says in verse 14, under the sun. And a couple other verses that I wanted to read, because I know we kind of just skimmed through half the book there in a few seconds. These are just a few various verses from those chapters that stood out to me as I was reading this week, so I'll just read them. You don't need to flip unless you'd like to. But in the beginning of chapter 2, the teacher says, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? I undertook great projects, I built houses for myself, and planted vineyards. I denied myself nothing that my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all of my labor, and yet this was the reward for all of my toil. When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. And then just a few verses later, in chapter 2, verse 18, he says, I hated all of the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Now, those are just literally a few verses. But again, those entire 6 chapters are basically making that same point, that all of the things on this earth, no matter how good they are, because not everything on that list is necessarily inherently bad, but all of those things, no matter how good they may seem at the time, are ultimately meaningless. Or to use the word of the teacher, everything is indeed hevel. And if that was where the book of Ecclesiastes were to end, that would make for a pretty depressing sermon. And I think that if we're being honest with ourselves, sort of that unsettledness, that confusion of like, what is this book saying, is not just true in Ecclesiastes, but it's true throughout all of the wisdom literature books. They all have these themes of depression, confusion, things that are sometimes true but not always true, and basically we can't put our finger on anything. Everything feels less than clear. That's kind of the theme of wisdom literature, right? And it will continue to be the theme in the weeks to come. And as easy as it is to react to these books in those ways, and maybe even say, I'm good. I'm certainly not going to take a class on wisdom literature, and I think Sunday morning is about all I want to do with those books. I think that deep down, even though we kind of want to reject those feelings of unease, I think that we understand what the wisdom literature authors are really trying to say deep down, because we've all experienced those things. We've all experienced times like the book of Proverbs talks about, where things generally go well for us when we're living wisely and living rightly, but not always. And we've experienced times, like Job did, when suffering seems to have no reason, even when we're doing all the right things. And certainly, like Ecclesiastes talks about, we can pursue good things and still feel empty, still feel meaningless, even if we're living in a wise or upright way. And life might go better at times and give us some temporary meaning if we do those things, but there are always the two great equalizers. As Drew was studying for his sermon on the book of Job last week, he sent me this little quote from one of his commentaries that I found super helpful. I'm going to put it on the screen, and then I'm going to explain it because it's from a commentary, so it's a little complicated, but I will explain it after I read it. And that says, the contrast between the views of the character Job and the teachings of Kohelet is instructive. Proverbs couches the retribution principle in proverbial language. Ecclesiastes casts suspicion on it, and the book of Job details its limitations. So the retribution principle is basically the idea that good people are rewarded with good things in their life, and bad people are rewarded with evil things or with negative consequences. And basically what this commentary is saying is that wisdom literature helps us see that the retribution principle just doesn't always apply. Proverbs says it applies sometimes, but it's not a promise or a prophecy. It's just proverbial. Job simply showed us that that was very limited and that Job was a wonderful person and things did not go well. And Ecclesiastes casts suspicion on that idea, basically saying, like, it's just not that cut and dry. It's just not that simple or predictable. And that same commentary later on went on to almost have this pretend conversation between the character of Job and Kohelet, who again is that's the word for the teacher in Ecclesiastes. And the whole conversation was really interesting. Again, it's not real, it's made up by this scholar. But this one quote from that conversation stood out to me, where the teacher says, "We cannot have all the answers, Job. We don't even know all the questions. We must be content to accept God's wisdom in our lives." So, where does that lead us? Because we only made it through chapter 6, And I promise there's a little bit of a positive spin to the book of Ecclesiastes. So after chapter 6, the tone starts to shift slightly. Certainly not all the way. He still throws in everything is meaningless about every other verse. But the teacher starts to introduce a glimmer of hope. And basically what he says is that despite the fact that he has proven, he has shown, he has experienced that life is meaningless, two things are still true. Wisdom is worthwhile, and it would be good for us to enjoy what parts of life we can. And what he means by that is that even though he says that a pursuit of a life lived wisely will ultimately leave us empty, so will a life full of folly. And he holds that even though this retribution principle doesn't always hold true, it's still the right thing to do to live wisely and to live according to God's design. And so, Ecclesiastes is not, in case you were getting this out of the sermon, it's not condoning an anything goes approach. And secondly, even though that these things cannot ultimately bring eternal meaning to our lives, again, many of those things that the teacher observed on his quest aren't wrong, and many of them are worth enjoying. And tons of verses throughout the second half of the book really drive this home. Chapter 7, verse 14 says, when times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other. Chapter 8, verse 15 says, so I commend the enjoyment of life because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all of the days of the life that God has given them under the sun. And finally, chapter 9, verses 7 through 9 says, go, eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart. For God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in white and always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love, all of the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. So here is our big question for today. And the reason that I'm giving you a big question instead of a big idea, so to speak, is that I kind of feel like it just fits the tone of wisdom literature. There are not a lot of definitive, always true statements in the wisdom literature books, and so instead I'm going to pose a question that I hope the answer will be encouraging too. And that is this: how do we live in a world full of hevel? How do we live in a world full of meaninglessness? And so to answer that, we're going to turn to those last 6 verses, or 31 pages, whichever you prefer, of chapter 12. And basically, just for clarification's sake, Drew said I had to say this, this is technically the author concluding the teachings of the teacher. It's not a direct quote from the teacher. Just in case somebody were to ask you later this week, now you know the truth. But the author is concluding the teacher's teachings for him. So we're just going to read verses 13 and 14, because I know I've swamped you with more verses of Ecclesiastes than necessarily anyone wanted to hear. So here is what verse 13 says. Now all has been heard, and here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So, regardless of how confusing and complicated the rest of the book of Ecclesiastes is, this passage, I think, really does a beautiful job of ending the book on a positive note. And he is saying there is an answer to the lifelong quest for meaning. It's this: to fear God and keep his commandments. Which sounds good, but I want to break that down a little bit for us because that's kind of a very churchy answer. And so I want to make sure that we can all really figure out how to apply that and answer the question of how can we live in a world full of hevel. So there's a resource called the Bible Project. If you haven't checked it out yet, while we've been on this year-long journey, I highly encourage you to. And I can't take credit for the entirety of this list. They helped me shape it. But here are some of the answers that I think we can utilize to help us answer that question. So how do we live in a world full of hevel? The first thing we can do is just embrace it. Accept that life is out of our control, which personally, I, as a control freak, really hate, but that's just the facts. And if we haven't already experienced that life is out of our control, we probably will in the very near future, maybe even this afternoon. And one thing I want to caveat this with, basically what this is kind of saying is there isn't necessarily no meaning in life, even though that's what the teacher is saying. He's basically saying that it's confusing, it's unpredictable, fleeting, and it's totally out of our control. And so we would do better if we stopped striving to grab onto that smoke and instead just realized that it passes through our hands. The next way that I think we can do that is to enjoy the little things when we can. Again, most of the things that the teacher explored in his quest for meaning aren't bad. Most of them were things that all of us are doing on a daily basis. Going to work, spending time with our families, probably trying to make money so we can pay our bills. And he isn't saying that those things are wrong, they just simply don't provide ultimate meaning. And it's okay to enjoy those things. It is okay because they are gifts from God, and he's designed us and designed this world for those things to bring us pleasure. Thirdly, this is a really easy one. Don't try to answer all the existential questions and puzzles because it's all meaningless. No. Basically, he's saying that while searching for wisdom and knowledge, while that searching isn't necessarily bad, even if you were to come to the ultimate conclusion of knowledge and wisdom, which you won't, even if you would, that would not give you what you're ultimately longing for. Again, I think of that pretend conversation between the teacher and Job, where he says, "We cannot have all the answers, Job, for we don't even know all the questions." The fourth is to hold this intention that Hevel is real, and for those of us who know God, this world is not the end. And this point is really, really important. And I know it's like the fourth point in a list of points at the end of a sermon. And so you're probably like, why is she putting this really important thing in here? But I think it's worth mentioning that Ecclesiastes is in the Old Testament. So it was written prior to Jesus. It was written prior to his birth, death, and resurrection. And so the perspective that the teacher, who's a God-fearing wise man, has is not the perspective that all of us living in post-Jesus times have. They had no idea what life with Jesus could look like because he hadn't yet come. He had been promised, right? But he was sort of this like in the back of their mind, no idea how the Lord's going to solve this like lifelong quest for meaningless stuff. So the writer of Ecclesiastes and the readers of the time didn't have the perspective that we do, that this world is not the end and this world is not our home. And Hevel and that meaninglessness and the despair that we all feel is all real. And so even though that's a tension that we have to hold, I think that realizing that we have a different perspective on it is really, really encouraging. I could probably preach an entire sermon on that, but I wanted to just make sure that even though, again, it's the fourth item in the list, it's really, really important. And fifth, wrestling with these questions doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It doesn't mean that you're not pursuing your relationship with God. Again, the teacher was a wise man, a God-fearing man, and he still felt this emptiness. He still felt this meaninglessness. And I think it's kind of tempting for us to maybe think in terms of that retribution principle. So to basically say, well, if my life feels empty or if my life feels meaningless, then I'm messing up or sinning. And while sometimes I think that lack of peace can point us to things in our life that need to be examined, everyone experiences this, even followers of Jesus. So finally, back to the end of the book, the quest for meaning comes down to this: fear God and keep his commandments. And while I think that those 5 previous tips are helpful, even though they're challenging, what ultimately will bring meaning to our lives is knowing God, loving him, and keeping in perspective that life with him is truly what brings meaning and purpose. And everything else, even if it's good for a moment, and it oftentimes will be, everything else, when all things fade away, is Hevel. All right, you guys are champs. I think we covered more in 25 minutes than I did in an entire semester. Again, that could have been because I was sleep deprived, basically all of my time there, and so that could have contributed to why I don't remember anything. But in all seriousness, Ecclesiastes is a complex book. It's not one that you're probably going to turn to when you need a little pick-me-up in your devotional life, right? But I hope that you're walking away from this morning feeling somewhat like I am, and that is thankful, which might sound strange, right? Because again, the book was filled with everything is meaningless, everything is a chasing after the wind, and nothing can be gained under the sun. And even though, yes, those things are true, and the book does say that, the reason that I feel thankful and hope that you do as well is that life doesn't end for followers of Jesus with this meaninglessness. And even though the things that I'm striving for, the things that you're striving for will often leave you feeling empty, that is not all we have. That is not the end for us because we are children of God, followers of Jesus, and beloved by the King of the universe. And no matter how empty and meaningless or how good at times it may feel, this world is not our home. And so even when we don't have the answers or even know the questions to be asking, I think it comes down to this. Fear God, keep his commandments, because he has got eternity under control, and he simply asks us to trust him. And for that, I am thankful.